All right, it's 1:32. I think I'll go ahead and get going. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Alex Zarowski. I'm one of the public health educators at the Washington Poison Center. We're going to spend the next hour talking about cannabis. So first off, a big old thank you. First off to the Verdant Health Commission. It's through their funding, their grant, that we are able to create this program along with others as well. Also, thank you to Kirsten and through the East Valley Community Coalition for helping to organize this and partnering with us to get this particular training going today. And thank you for being here. And then Kirsten, did you want to go ahead and say anything about EVCC?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone for joining. We're really excited to get to offer this type of education to our community during this time. East Valley Community Coalition is located in East Valley, Spokane, and we're committed to providing programs and prevention services for our families to help combat youth substance use. So I threw my email in the chat if you have any questions about East Valley. Or if you'd like to send me an email so I can make sure you get your certificate, clock hours, or the slides when we're done here. Or you can also just pop it in the chat and I'll make sure that I take it down. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. All right, here we go. So this is me, since I'm not going to have my camera on today. You get to see me and this lovely brick wall behind me. So some housekeeping. Please, throughout all this, stay muted. I think we're all probably a bit more used to webinar etiquette these days, but it helps things stay a little more focused if we all stay muted and we don't get anyone's accidental, chip bag crinkles that get captured there. That doesn't mean to not engage, though. Please ask any and all questions you have. Just do so in the chat box. I'm going to do my best to periodically lay eyes on that chat box and address things as I can. If we run out of time and I haven't answered your question, because this is being recorded, I'll be able to see the transcript of the chat box after the fact. And so any follow-up materials we send out, I'll be sure to address all the questions I can. And again, this webinar is being recorded. I don't think anyone has their camera on now. It's totally fine if you turn your camera on, but just know whatever facial expression you make will be preserved forever. All right, so if this is helpful for us to kind of see our reach. If you wouldn't mind typing in the chat box what city you're tuning in from now. And if you'd rather stay anonymous, that's no problem. You can change the settings so that you send it to the organizers rather than everyone. And I'll just go ahead and move along while folks are doing that. So thank you. Here's our agenda for today. So we're going to first talk about the Washington Poison Center, who we are, what we do, and why we're talking about cannabis. Then we're going to talk about cannabis a bit. Then we'll go through some legality, which requires a bit of history, and we'll discuss modes of use as well as health correlations. So a bit of a caveat or qualifier, I should say, before we dive in. You're hearing me use the term cannabis. There's also the term marijuana and pot and weed and all these other terms. All of these terms do definitely have distinctions in nuance and stigma in history, and they all refer to the same substance, the same plant, the same drug. If you have questions on any of that, I'm happy to chat about it, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to zip on through right now. All right, so the Washington Poison Center. First off, this is how we define a poison. We use this very broad definition. For us, a poison is anything, any product or substance that is even potentially harmful if it's used in the wrong way, by the wrong person, or in the wrong amount. So that can be household supplies, that could be plants, that could be soaps and cleaners and disinfectants. This is definitely on our minds a lot more throughout the COVID pandemic. This can also include bites or stings from animals, bugs, and other critters. It can also include medications, other substances, alcohol, that kind of thing. So there's so many things that could be a poison. So our mission is to prevent and reduce harm from poisoning through expertise, through collaboration and education. And what we're doing today lands in that last term there, education. We've been doing this for over 60 years. The Washington Poison Center has existed in one form or another for over 60 years, which is pretty cool to me. So our bread and butter is this telephone number here. This is our national toll-free telephone health line. You call this number, you will be routed to whatever local poison center, depending on your area code. And all poison centers are always open. So you could call us 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. And someone will answer. Poison information specialist will answer. Or excuse me, it's a different one. It's specialist in poison information. I use the old term. Now, again, this is a free health line, so no one's ever going to ask you for billing, for insurance, or anything like that. It's also totally confidential, so the same laws that protect your privacy in a hospital or a doctor's office, those HIPAA laws, they apply to us as well. And we also offer interpretation services in over 260 languages. So go ahead and hit me up with any poison center specific questions you have, but in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and move on to cannabis. So what is cannabis? First and foremost, it's a plant. The term cannabis sativa refers to the scientific taxonomic name for this plant. Now, this one plant has all these different variations and subtypes, and some of them are used to create non-drug products. So you see this rope, this twine here. This is what folks call hemp, which is a non-psychoactive version of this plant. It's also used to create a bunch of drug products. Some of these drug products are psychoactive, some are not psychoactive at all. And to confuse things more, they're all called cannabis. So for the drug versions, they interact with your body through what's called the endocannabinoid system. Now, we call this a neuromodulatory system. That basically means it exists to help monitor, to help control, to help regulate other body systems. Now, it's a fairly recent discovery, so we're still learning more and more and more about it all the time. But one of the big takeaways is that everyone on this call, every human, I think every mammal has this system in them. So a cannabinoid, this is just a very general term for a chemical compound that binds to some of these receptors, to these endocannabinoid receptors. There are two main types of cannabinoids. We've got endocannabinoids, just like that system. These refer to the cannabinoids that are in you right now. They are regulated and found in the body. So someone can go their entire life without ever seeing, using, touching, smelling cannabis, the plant, and they still have these cannabinoids doing their thing. We also have this other category called phytocannabinoids. Phyto means plant, so these are the cannabinoids that come from plants, mainly from cannabis, but we also see them in others, such as echinacea, such as cacao. That's what we make. That's what we get chocolate from. We're still learning more and more about this system, but to date we have found over 100 cannabinoids, or identified over 100 cannabinoids. We're going to talk about two specifically throughout this hour. So, like I said, this is a recent discovery. We're still learning more and more about it, but we think that this system, by directly influencing neurotransmitters and other chemicals in the body and brain, we think that it indirectly helps to regulate all sorts of stuff, such as stress and anxiety behaviors, processes attached to learning, to memory, our sense of reward and reinforcement, and a bunch of other things. So it's a very complicated, very widespread system. So we're going to mainly talk about THC and CBD today. I'm sure folks have heard of these, no problem if not. So THC stands for delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Say that 5 times fast. This is the most like chemistry related we're going to get today, don't worry. So THC is the main psychoactive component in cannabis. Psychoactive means mind altering. So this is what is responsible generally for someone's intoxication or sense of getting high off of cannabis. Now, CBD, on the other hand, this is cannabidiol. Truly, I don't know what's the correct way to say that. I've heard it both ways. On its own, we do not believe that it is psychoactive. Having said that, we do think that it can alter the effects of other cannabinoids. So it can interact with THC. It can interact with other cannabinoids and sort of alter how one might experience them. So part of why we care about the endocannabinoid system is we know that it is extremely active during adolescence. Now, one of the hallmarks of adolescence is this brain development, this neural restructuring. We go from this our brains being in a very plastic state, very adaptable, very malleable, to much more refined. And again, because this is a neuromodulatory system, it's very much responsible for keeping certain systems calm and making sure they don't get too excited, essentially. We still don't know a lot of these mechanisms, though. We can just tell that it's very active, especially during adolescence. So one of the big concerns is if you take this critical period in someone's life, in someone's development, and you take this critical system involved with that process, what happens if you start throwing these external cannabinoids into the mix? And really, for a lot of things, we don't fully know. And so that's one of the big concerns. There are a lot of folks who are concerned about long-term consequences for coping with stress and emotion. So a lot of folks report using cannabis to help cope with stress, with anxiety. Well, what happens if someone becomes so reliant on that and then they stop using? What will they then have to do? So there are a lot of other concerns as well. And there's also this just larger concern of dependence. And we do know that the earlier someone initiates use of, well, pretty much any substance, but cannabis especially here, it increases the risk of dependence on cannabis. So what do we mean when I say dependence? So dependence, very broadly, occurs when your brain, when your body starts to rely on some outside external substance to maintain a normal function. My example for this is coffee, specifically caffeine, and I am an avid coffee drinker. Now I would say, a physical dependence on a certain amount of coffee every morning to maintain my normal function of being awake, of being alert, of being engaged. Now, tolerance occurs when you need to have more and more and more of that substance to just maintain that baseline normal function. So using that coffee example again, when I first started drinking coffee as an undergrad in college, I would maybe have a cup or two to study for finals, and jump ahead years later, and here I am now. I have 1 or 2 cups minimum every morning, and that's an example of I've built a tolerance over the years. So with dependence, reducing or quitting that external substance leads to withdrawal symptoms. Now, withdrawal can manifest in so many different ways. Using the coffee example again, for me, if I just stopped having coffee this morning, you'd probably hear a less chatty version of me today. I'd be a little more cranky, a little more irritable. I might have a headache. So these are all just kind of mild examples of withdrawal symptoms. So addiction, very broadly, occurs when dependence, this physical dependence, starts to become disruptive to other aspects of life. And that's very broad. And dependence itself is a symptom of addiction. So why do we bring this up? Well, a part of it is that there is so much rhetoric that I've heard, at least, about how cannabis is not addictive or does not bring about dependence, or if it is, it doesn't do so nearly as much as other substances, such as heroin or nicotine. And heroin and nicotine especially are very addictive. They bring about that physical dependence very, very powerfully and quickly. And just because cannabis may not do so as thoroughly as these sort of heavy hitting substances, it does not mean that that cannabis does not bring about dependence. Folks who use cannabis who then report quitting often or reducing their intake oftentimes report withdrawal. And again, withdrawal implies dependence. So some of the common withdrawal symptoms we've come across is sleep disruption. Sleep disruption is huge. Anxiety, another big one. Irritability, depression or depressed mood, and headaches. Now, one of the big struggles, whether this is for research or with someone just trying to treat something for themselves, is that with these withdrawal symptoms might overlap with the reason someone might be using cannabis to begin with. So say someone's sleeping poorly. They end up taking cannabis to try to sleep better. Maybe it works for a bit, and maybe they start to develop a tolerance and they need more and more and more. And then they stop entirely and they sleep horribly again, and you get this sort of feedback loop there. All right, now we're gonna move on to acute effects, but I'm first gonna lay eyes and see if anyone has any questions. I'm not seeing any yet, so I will keep moving on. All right, so acute means short term, in the moment. So when we're talking about acute effects from cannabis, we're talking about in the moment short-term intoxication effects. This is not the long-term health effects yet. We'll discuss that a bit later. So the way the Poison Center categorizes cannabis exposures, we have these mild or moderate symptoms as well as severe symptoms. Mild and moderate symptoms include just sleepiness, folks feeling pretty out of it. We get a lot of calls with euphoria. Euphoria just means you're feeling really good. For any neurotransmitter folks, nerds out there like myself, this is largely connected to dopamine. And dopamine is very, very much connected to that sense of reinforcement and reward. We also get symptoms of like loss of social inhibition. We hear about giddiness. We hear about the kind of broad category of mood alterations. That can include a lot. That can include paranoia. That can include anxiety, agitation. Now we start to get really concerned with these severe symptoms. So dilated pupils. We sometimes hear reports of decreased tone. So this can be sort of this floppiness in the muscles. And we actually have had calls for folks who have gone into a coma. Now these cases were specifically little kids who had gotten into a concentrated product. I'll speak a bit more to concentrates later on. And I will say these were all temporary. So all of these folks who had gone through the coma came out of it, which is worth noting. And it's still incredibly alarming anytime coma has entered the game. All right, so other acute intoxication symptoms. This is just stuff I've come across in throughout the literature. So I've seen a lot on impaired cognition, attention and concentration, memory formation, coordination and motor function. These are very important for driving skills. We also get this very odd phenomenon of impaired time estimation, where a lot of folks report that only a half an hour has gone by, for example, but to them it feels like hours and hours have gone by. We also can see increased heart rate and blood pressure. For some folks, we've actually seen improved airflow, which is very odd. I want to emphasize this here. This is specifically seen for newer users and tends to reverse with long-term use. And I think the mechanism there might be that the increased metabolism, the increased heart rate and blood pressure might indirectly improve that airflow. There's also this very big concern for a large intake leading to a psychosis. And this is especially true for folks in adolescence. And I'll speak again to psychosis and schizophrenia a bit later. Just want to really drive this point home. It is not wise. It is not safe to use cannabis and then drive, period. Cannabis definitely impairs a lot of these needed skills to drive safely. One thing I will say too, according to the Washington Traffic Safety Commission, we have seen an overall decrease in alcohol-only DUIs, and that's a good thing. But we are starting to see a pretty sharp increase in polysubstance DUIs. That means using multiple substances together. And the most commonly combined substances are cannabis and alcohol. So this is very concerning to us. We've also heard this very strange phenomenon where, again, according to the Washington Traffic Safety Commission, they did a big survey and they asked a lot of drivers who report using cannabis if they use cannabis when they drive and why. And a lot of folks reported, oh, I use cannabis to sober up from alcohol so I can drive safely. I would just like to clear the air that is not a thing. That is not how cannabis intoxication works. And a lot of folks may truly believe that they are safe to drive. But one of the tricky parts of using multiple substances is it diminishes our ability to gauge our own sobriety. So that is an incredibly important message to walk away with today. Safe storage. This is one of the main messages of the Poison Center, regardless of whether it's cannabis or alcohol or medication or whatever it might be, to store it safely. This can be locking it up in a lockbox like you see here. This could be keeping it up high, out of sight, out of reach. This is especially important if there are little ones in the house, if there are little kids. We don't want folks to, we don't want kids accidentally getting into something they shouldn't. We also want to encourage folks to, take their medications kind of away from kids so that they don't build in that modeling behavior. All right, we get this question a lot of what happens if we're too high? What do you do if you're too high? And so we asked our call takers because the educators like myself, we're not trained to give treatment advice. So we asked our call takers, what do you tell folks? And first they told us that there's really no one thing you can take or you can do to bring down that level of intoxication. A lot of it is really waiting it out. They definitely said don't take additional drugs. I've heard a lot of folks say, oh, you just take some CBD, you'll come right down. There's no data to back that I've been able to find. So we definitely encourage folks to kind of stay put, to not drive, don't operate machinery. Be careful about falls because of that important coordination and motor function impairment. Folks can fall down. And it can be good to have a buddy, someone to kind of make sure you're okay. And if anyone ever needs, give the Poison Center a call. It does not have to be an emergency to reach out to us. Our call takers are absolutely happy to just answer information calls. All right, gonna lay eyes on the chat box again before diving into legality. All right, not seeing anything. Thanks for bearing with me, folks, and my rather high level of energy today. Okay, so I like to build context for things. That's kind of how I think. And I think it's really important to see where this legality has come from, where our current very strange state of this substance that is federally illegal, yet states are legalizing anyway. How did that come to be? So cannabis has been used agriculturally for years. Has been produced agriculturally for years. In the early 1900s, hemp, which again is that non-psychoactive version of the plant, it was a huge agricultural product in the U.S. All the way up through the 1950s. And hemp can be used to make all sorts of stuff: rope and fabric and soap and some very interesting stuff. Now you'll notice this big gray bar continues on to present. And I did that to emphasize that while commercial agriculture kind of ceased around the 1950s, illicit sort of underground agriculture continued. If it didn't, we would not have the industry that we have today. All right, so jumping ahead to the 30s, this is when things start to get kind of dicey. And you see this orange bar that has fear and racism called out from the 30s to the present. So for folks who've not heard of this fella, Harry Anslinger, he's a particularly problematic historical figure. He was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Now, this entity came into existence in order to enforce prohibition. So when alcohol was illegal. Well, once prohibition ended and alcohol was legalized once more, they sort of turned their sights on other substances. And one of the main focuses, one of the main targets was cannabis. And now here's a quote here to kind of highlight some of that early on stigma and racism that started to come into being. Now, a quote from Harry Anslinger here: the primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effects on the degenerate races. And I hate reading that quote, but I think it's really important to not forget that history. Now, you'll notice here too, he uses the term marijuana, and this was a very tactical decision. So cannabis was the main term back in the early 1900s, and marijuana was one Spanish term for the plant. And a lot of his goals with a lot of his propaganda was to take existing anti-immigration and racist rhetoric and combine it to link it with cannabis use. And so he started intentionally using the term marijuana to try to bring that into being. Folks may have heard of the 1936 propaganda film Reefer Madness. If you haven't, I encourage you to check it out. A lot of libraries have it. It's a fascinating little bit of history. So this is a poster from Reefer Madness. Here's another poster, and you see a lot of imagery here of devil's harvest, smoke and hell, debauchery. You get weed with roots in hell, and this other one, horror, shame, and in despair. And this was a lot of, again, that early on source of stigma, source of misinformation. All right, so I think it's important, especially these days, to acknowledge that this is still playing out. While we don't necessarily have that same kind of Reefer Madness propaganda as directly, we see a lot of that stigma, a lot of that racism play out in the inequities of enforcement. So some research has gone into this, looking at Washington arrest rates before 2012. That's the year I-502 passed. That's when we legalized retail cannabis in Washington. So prior to this, so So a lot of the goals, a lot of the advocacy, a lot of the push for I-502 was to reduce overall arrest rates and to address, from the social justice perspective, to address the disparity in arrest rates. Now, historically, African Americans specifically, as well as other folks of color, have been arrested significantly more than white folks. And in a lot of ways, 502, it did help. Overall arrest rates went down. However, the disparity of arrests did not reduce in the same way. So looking at possession arrest rates, we see some progress here. So this comes from, I believe it was a 2018 study. And pre-legalization, African Americans were arrested 2.67 times more than white folks. Now that disparity dropped to about 2.3 times greater, so that's about a 14% decrease. And that is progress, but it's not nearly as much as we'd like to see. Now looking at sales arrests, so folks who are arrested for selling cannabis illegally, this disparity actually more than doubled. And so there is still significantly more work to do from a social justice perspective. So I-502 has done a bit, but it has not done enough. All right, so moving on to taxation. So jumping back to the 1930s, 1937 was when the Marijuana Tax Act passed, and this forced taxes on all cannabis sales. Well, then by the 50s, you'll recall I mentioned commercial agriculture had sort of ceased by this point. And so we started to see this criminalization shift. And by 1970, this is when former President Nixon instilled the Controlled Substances Act, and that labeled cannabis as a Schedule I drug. And I'll read this verbatim. Schedule I drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Now that means that the federal government views cannabis as having a high potential for addiction, for dependence, as well as having no therapeutic, no medical value. And to put this in historical context more, 1971, the year after this, was when Nixon announced the war on drugs, or declared the war on drugs. Now we're jumping to the 90s. We get this little sliver at the end of legalization. Even with this massive federal setup with the Schedule I system, somehow California was able to put together its medical marijuana program and infrastructure in 1996. Then we jump to 2012. That's when Washington and Colorado set up our retail cannabis infrastructures. So you've probably heard medical versus retail a lot, but in case folks are confused as to the distinction, medical very broadly just means that a state has decided that there are certain medical ailments that someone might gain some relief through cannabis from. And so they allow certain conditions to allow authorization into the medical cannabis marketplace. Now, all states that do this do it differently. Retail, on the other hand, removes the medical requirement and just puts an age restriction there. And so every state that is legalized so far, 21 years and older is the age they have gone with, just like alcohol. All right, so we put together this little time lapse just to show kind of how over time this has really started to build momentum. So we're now in 1996. All the gray states means there's no legal market. Blue will mean medical, and green will mean retail. So let's see if this works right. Here we go. So we get the early 2000s, and there's more medical popping up. Then by the time, watch what happens at 2012 right now. So now we start to really get that momentum, that kind of snowball effect, jumping up to present day here. So right now, and this will very likely change by the end of this year, we have 33 states with some form of medical cannabis or marijuana infrastructure. We have 11 states, as well as Washington, D.C., that have both retail and medical right now. So stay tuned come election season, because this will probably go up quite a bit. Now, you've heard me mention hemp a couple times. I think it's important to acknowledge the 2018 Farm Bill. So hemp, prior to 2018, was a Schedule I substance. So same exact classification as cannabis. What the 2018 Farm Bill did is it removed hemp from the schedule system entirely. Now, hemp, they're defining as cannabis with less than 0.3% THC. Why this is significant is that hemp producers can now legally extract CBD from hemp. And this is why we've seen that almost overnight explosion of CBD products, not just within cannabis retail stores, but within grocery stores, within pharmacies, within gas stations. CBD is everywhere right now. All right, so a little bit on I-502. Even with our current legality, there are a lot of limitations. So folks have to purchase from licensed retailers. Folks have to be at least 21 years of age, not just to purchase, but to possess or to use. And it is still illegal to use in public. It is still illegal to drive under the influence. Washington, I believe, is the only state that does not allow folks to grow at home if they don't have that medical marijuana authorization. Now, one thing that trips a lot of folks up is that it's illegal to take across state and tribal lines. So take Oregon, for example. Oregon also has medical and retail cannabis. You cannot legally take Washington retail cannabis into Oregon and vice versa. It's also illegal to use on federal lands, waters, and property within a state with legalized retail. So you can't take cannabis to Rainier National Park because that federal jurisdiction applies. All right, we're going to step away from legality now. We're going to talk a bit about modes of use. So this is just a bit of a snapshot. We're going to talk a little bit about smoking, edibles, vaping, dabbing, and just acknowledge that there are these alternative methods that exist as well. I want to give the caveat that a lot of the products we're going to discuss, some might have just one cannabinoid. Others might have a plethora of cannabinoids. So some may focus just on CBD, some just THC, some will have a combo of both, and plenty of others that we're not even going into today. So the most common method of using cannabis is smoking, and that is very simply through some apparatus, through rolling a kind of a cigarette, or using a pipe, using a bong, taking this plant material, lighting it on fire, and breathing in the smoke. One thing to kind of keep in mind with this is a joint refers to just sort of a classic cannabis cigarette. That's where someone takes rolling paper and they fill it with cannabis. A spliff uses both cannabis and tobacco, and a blunt is cannabis wrapped in cigar paper. Cigar paper is actually made from pressed tobacco leaves, so folks may not realize that smoking a blunt, they're also getting a nicotine exposure, and the same is true with spliffs. Little bit on edibles and drinkables. So THC can make its way into all sorts of foods. One of the big hallmarks of edibles is that there is a big delay in the onset of effects. This can be concerning for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest is driving. So someone might take an edible, feel totally fine, and then decide they want to go to the store or something. And then it might kick in while they're driving. One of the other concerns is because it takes a while to kick in. It can take, as quick as 40 minutes for some. It could take up to 4 hours for other folks. Everyone is different with their own metabolism, their own endocannabinoid system, their own tolerance. Because of this difference, if someone is not used to taking edibles, they might have one, a couple hours go by, they don't feel anything, then they might have another. And by the time it kicks in, it's all in there, and they're unfortunately just sort of stuck with the dose that they consumed. Now, the most common quote-unquote serving size folks see in Washington is 10 milligrams of THC, and that's pretty arbitrary. That can be an extremely powerful dose for some folks that may not do much of anything to other folks. We're starting to see more and more other dosages, so we're starting to see 5 milligrams THC or 1 milligram THC. And a lot of products will actually contain more than one serving, and when they do that, they're required to have every individual serving securely packaged. And the idea with that is so that a kid doesn't walk by and say, "Ooh, gummy bears," and consume a bunch or consume any. Okie dokie. So one of the big tricky parts around edibles, there are a lot of rules right now on how things cannot it can't be marketed to be especially appealing to youth, and that's really tricky to enforce because that's a very subjective stance. So going back to this, like a lot of folks would look at this Marmas package and say that is totally appealing to youth, and it is still in the market right now. And you'll notice these are called fruit gems rather than gummies, because gummy, the term gummy, is too much like candy, and so that's not allowed. So you'll also note some of these have this little hand logo on them, and that actually came from some collaboration between the Washington Poison Center, the Liquor Cannabis Board, as well as folks in the cannabis industry. We all agreed that edibles and drinkables should have this logo on it with the Poison Center number there. And the idea with this isn't to teach kids, hey, don't eat this. It's to teach adults, store this safely. Once again, we're bringing it back to the safe storage message. All right, a bit on vaping. So vaping is essentially heating up a product, a cannabis product, just shy of the point of combustion. Combustion is when it catches fire. So a lot of you, there's a range here, 350 degrees Fahrenheit to 465 degrees Fahrenheit. Most users tend to try to get this quote unquote sweet spot of 450 to 465 degrees, because that tends to vaporize all cannabinoids. Different cannabinoids have different vaporization temperatures. And I should say, I'm using the term vaping, vaporizer. Really, this isn't a water vapor that's being produced. It is an aerosol. And so these are very small particles that are entering the lungs. And you'll see a whole variety of types here. You have these non-portable desktop, tabletop versions, and then with the introduction of e-cigarettes to the market, we're starting to see a bunch of other vape pens as well, these more portable styles. And there are two main types of cannabis folks will vaporize. That'll be either the dried flower or bud, or concentrates. So as the name implies for concentrates, they tend to have a much higher concentration of THC. So dried flower and bud tends to have anywhere from 5 to 30% THC, huge range. This is much more potent than cannabis used to be back in the 1960s and 70s. And with concentrates, we tend to see BHO, that's a butane hash oil. That's just one of many methods for extraction, taking the cannabinoids out of this plant material. We also see CO2 oil, and those tend to be in those cartridges a bit more. You'll also notice a giant range of anywhere from 50 to 95% THC. So folks may have heard of dabbing. Dabbing's kind of tricky. So dabbing, some folks use the term dabbing interchangeably with the term vaping. The way we understand dabbing is that it's a similar process, but it uses much higher heat, 750 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit. So with the setup that this individual is using in the picture, they had likely used a blowtorch to superheat that metal there, and then they use this little tool called a dab tool or a dabber to put a very tiny bit of that concentrated product, likely BHO, onto the superheated surface. Then this bong is filled with water, so folks would breathe that plume, that concentrated aerosol, in through the water, which cools it and condenses it, and they get an extremely high dose of THC. So one of the big concerns here is, well, anytime you're mixing intoxication with a blowtorch, I feel like folks should be concerned. There's also potential to get a much higher dose than intended. This is sort of opposite from edibles in some ways, in that it takes effect very, very rapidly. And we won't go into them, but there are these other alternative methods. So tinctures are becoming more popular. They tend to be, like placed under the tongue or swallowed. If they're swallowed, they act kind of like an edible. They're absorbed through the tongue. They tend to take effect a little faster. You're also going to see a lot of these topicals, so lotions and creams and ointments. And then there are a bunch of others. We've more recently learned that suppositories are becoming more of a thing with cannabis, with different cannabinoids there. All right, I'm going to take a quick drink of water because I've been speaking hyperspeed for a moment. Please hit me with any questions while I do so. All right, not seeing any questions. We're going to dive into health correlations. Now you'll notice I'm using the term correlations rather than effects, and this really speaks to the nature of the research. We don't always have enough evidence to say cannabis causes a given thing, but we can say, we notice co-occurrence between cannabis use and whatever this thing may be. So part of why we have such limited research is that cannabis is a Schedule I substance, which makes getting approval to research very difficult. And whenever folks do get approval to research cannabis, they generally are only allowed to use very low dose, very low THC smoked cannabis. So this is great to know what low dose smoked cannabis does, but as we were looking at the different concentrated products, the products on the market now are not low dose. They're very high dose, and we have so many other methods of use beyond smoking. We also have this issue of more and more and more products complicates the research. And like I said earlier, we have much higher THC dosages than we used to. Even looking just in Washington since legalization, the average dosage has increased. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through a series of evidence-based statements. These statements come from these two sources. They should be publicly available. I recommend checking them out. They're excellent sources. One on the left here is from 2017. The one on the right is from 2018. And so what we did is we took the level of evidence and matched it with plain language and further matched it to a letter grade, because no one wants to hear me list off, we have substantial evidence to back the claim that cannabis can. Who wants that? So instead, you'll hear me say, we very likely know that cannabis can lead to fill in the blank. And then further, you would see a big, big, big letter B up at the top of that slide. Please reach out if this is confusing to anyone, and I can go over it a little more. So this is the one time you'll hear me say we know something for cannabis, but based on these sources, we know that certain cannabinoids are an effective treatment of nausea and vomiting for folks undergoing chemotherapy. Now, these particular studies looked at, was actually FDA approved oral synthetic THC called nabilone and dronabinol, but they so closely approximate the chemical structure of THC, we can make the assumption that THC would serve the same effect here, which would also be an effective treatment. So this gets a B level of evidence. We very likely know that cannabinoids are an effective treatment for chronic pain management. Now, I should have said too, this first section, we're going through therapeutic effects first, then we're going to look at more of the health risks. So these cannabinoids that are likely to be effective treatment for chronic pain. This research actually came outside the US. So this is looking at nabiximols, which are not currently available in the US. They're undergoing trials, but they're used in Europe right now. And they're a combination of THC and CBD. More on therapeutic effects. We probably know that cannabis use is correlated with improved management of short-term sleep disturbance from a variety of sources. This is just what this research looked at. One of the big caveats with this particular therapeutic effect is sleep aids are difficult. Sleep aids are notorious for developing tolerance, and cannabis is no different. So THC, it might help reduce how long it takes someone to fall asleep, but because folks can build a tolerance to it, they may need to take more and more and more, and they may have to deal with some of the other effects of THC that they weren't after. CBD, on the other hand, there's not concern about dependence with it in the same way, but folks, the research behind CBD and sleep has shown that it seems to be effective in really high doses. Now, they classified a high dose as 160 milligrams or more, and that's a pretty potent dose. And we really don't know what else might be happening with CBD. One of the big concerns is that it might interact with other medications. So again, CBD, this is still within the therapeutic effects section. Looking at both of those sources, which are many hundreds of pages long, they're huge. The only CBD specific statements I could find were these two, that we may know that CBD is effective for improving anxiety symptoms, social anxiety disorders. And we do not know if CBD is an effective treatment for mental health outcomes in folks with schizophrenia. I know those seem really disconnected from each other. The only commonality there is CBD. And as little as we know about THC, we really know even less about CBD. All right, we're going to move on to health risks now. So starting with cancer, we very likely know of a correlation between heavy use, so this is daily or near daily, cannabis use in the development of pre-malignant lesions throughout the airway. That's pretty alarming. Pre-malignant means precancerous. Having said that, we've not been able to draw a correlation between cannabis use and lung, head, or neck cancers, which is very strange to me. The only cancer that these sources have been able to identify a link with was non-seminoma testicular cancer. Now, just because we can't pinpoint lung cancer does not mean there aren't other issues happening with the respiratory system. So we very likely know of a correlation between cannabis smoking, specifically smoking, and overall worse respiratory systems, such as cough, such as phlegm and sputum production, such as wheezing. And we also can see more frequent chronic bronchitis with long-term cannabis smoking. Now, the good part with this is this seems to be reversible. Folks reduce or quit use, and they tend to see these symptoms alleviate. Now, a little bit on psychosocial and cognitive. We very likely know that heavy cannabis users, again, this is daily or nearly daily, are more likely to experience memory impairments. And for this particular study, looked at adults, and they found for heavy users, these memory impairments would last for a week or more following abstinence. So when they would quit entirely, that might be a withdrawal symptom. That might be an effect of the use itself. We're not really sure, but we can track that memory impairment. Looking at adolescents, so we probably know, this is a C level of evidence, that cannabis use is linked with overall cognitive and academic impairment. And this impairment seemed to last at least a month following abstinence. I do want to emphasize, again, this is correlation, not causation. So we don't, the factors that lead to cannabis use might also be contributing to impaired academic performance. So there are a lot of factors there. But I do think it's important to note that cannabis use with youth, it could be a red flag that something else might be going on. All right, so I mentioned schizophrenia and psychosis earlier. We actually have a lot of evidence for this. We very likely know that cannabis use is correlated with the development of schizophrenia or psychosis, and this seems to be more prominent with heavier users. The theory behind this is that folks who are already at risk for developing psychosis or schizophrenia, cannabis might act as a catalyst and bring those effects on sooner. What's so strange, though, and this is really why we need to have more research on this, is that folks who have a psychotic disorder, history of cannabis use is actually linked with improved cognitive performance. Again, for those folks who already have psychotic disorder. So on one hand, cannabis might bring about these psychosis effects earlier, and at least for some folks, it might act as a bit of a protective measure if they end up developing a psychotic disorder. So this one, I really would love to see more research on this. All right, anxiety. So we probably know that regular cannabis use is linked with an increased incidence of social anxiety disorder. We actually have more evidence to see the link with social anxiety disorder than we do for any other anxiety disorder. But on depression, we have a bit more sense of direction here. We probably know that there's a correlation between cannabis use and an increased risk for later on developing a depressive disorder. But we don't know if cannabis use alters or changes symptoms for folks who already have a depressive disorder. All right, this is a pretty tough slide. So cannabis use, we probably know that it's correlated with suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and suicidal completion. And there seems to be a dose-dependent response. So more use seems to correlate with higher incidence of this. We're at the Poison Center, we're always concerned about intentional use of any substance. We've been especially concerned about this throughout COVID, because everyone has, at least most folks, have been a lot more isolated. There's a lot more stress. So even before COVID, 2019, 17% of all of our cases were intentional, and 11% of all of our cases were suspected suicide. This is across all ages, all substances. Now, our concern is that this increased stress and isolation would increase folks' risk of anxiety and depression, who then may look to substance use, to self-harm or suicide. And so we encourage folks to reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And for any immediate help after self-harm, for yourself, for a loved one, someone you're with, just call 911. Okay, so we're getting close to the end, folks. Thanks for bearing with me. This is a bit on pregnancy here. So we very likely know that maternal cannabis smoking is linked with lower birth weight of offspring. We may know, so less evidence here, we may know that cannabis use is linked with pregnancy complications for the birthing parent, as well as higher rates of admission to neonatal intensive care unit. What we don't know, though, is if maternal cannabis smoking is linked with later health outcomes in offspring. Folks could make that assumption, especially with that lower birth weight correlation. Lower birth weight is correlated with a lot of later on health outcomes, but we don't have that data just yet. Or if we do, I have not seen it. All right, just a little bit on the gateway hypothesis. So gateway hypothesis is the idea that using one substance is going to be a gateway and lead someone to use another substance. So we do see a correlation between cannabis use and other substance use disorders, but we don't have a sense of direction with that. What we do have direction with is cannabis use and tobacco use. So starting to use cannabis increases someone's likelihood of later on initiating tobacco use. What's actually more common, though, is that someone will start using tobacco, and that would lead, there's a greater likelihood that that would lead to cannabis use. All right, so we got through the lightning round just a couple slides ago. Health risks with CBD. So I mentioned earlier, there's that concern with medication interaction. There's also this concern for liver injury. You know, the liver is this massive filtration system. Most substances and medications have at least some level of processing in the liver, and there's this concern that that CBD might interact with or alter these enzymes that are necessary to break down toxicity. Now, the World Health Organization published a report, I believe in 2018, that didn't identify any dependence potential, but did note that there is concern from interaction with certain medications. And one of the big hallmarks of CBD right now, even though it is legal and you can find it most anywhere, any state, there's not thorough regulation and oversight over it. So there are plenty of false claims with it, false medical claims with it. There are plenty of products that claim to have CBD that don't actually have CBD. And there's just very little oversight and enforcement right now. And one of our big concerns is that if folks are seeking out CBD to help treat something, they may delay seeking out important and appropriate medical care. So one of our big warnings there for CBD. All right, we have 5 minutes to go, and I've included just a bit of links for advocacy and resources. These are all hyperlinks, so when we send these slides out, theoretically, the website, it should still take you to the proper website. The Poison Center, we publish a lot of our reports, so you're welcome to take a peek at what we have. Healthy Youth Survey is a great resource to get a sense of youth behaviors in Washington State. The UW Alcohol and Drug Institute also has excellent briefs and publications. And then we like to include the Washington Recovery Helpline there, as well as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Now, this is unfortunately a stronger snapshot of Western Washington coalitions, but I wager you all have a much better sense of Eastern Washington coalitions than I do. So if anyone has info they'd like me to include in these slides, so I can get a little more of a holistic sense of Washington, let me know. This is sort of an ever-growing, ever-evolving program. These are some great Department of Health resources, different campaigns that all target different audiences, so I recommend taking a peek there. And then there are tons of other ways to get involved for anyone who wants. The Liquor Cannabis Board, they generally hear from the industry more than anyone. And a lot of their meetings, their board meetings, are accessible. They're open to the public to join. And if folks haven't, it can be worth taking just a little field trip to a cannabis retail store to see what it's like and comparing it to other ones, and as well as going to a smoke shop. So we put together these little training kits with different devices and stuff. And for the most part, we were able to purchase all of our devices through a smoke shop rather than a cannabis retail shop. Once again, here is the Poison Center number. If folks haven't, I encourage you to put it in your phone. Just better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. All right, we've got 3 minutes to spare. I have not actually seen any questions go through the chat box. Please feel free to hit me up through the chat box now, or this is my email address. I'm happy to answer any and all questions as I can. Thank you all for making it through. We barely made it on time, but we did make it. And I'll stay on the call at least until 2:30, just to give folks a chance to process, because I know it was sort of like taking a drink out of a fire hose there. Yeah, let me know if you have questions. And again, this has been recorded, so we'll share that recording out. I'll share the recording and the slide deck with Kirsten, who can then share it out with everyone else. And if for some reason over the next week or so you don't hear from us, let me know. Reach out to me directly. Good chance I typed an email in wrong or something like that, and I'll be sure to get you the materials you need. All right, good deal. Not seeing any questions. I'll accept the praise. Thank you all. This is one of my favorite presentations to give. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of interesting stuff here.